My name is Ryan, and I'm an associate environment artist at Hi-Res. So I'm going to be showing you guys a bit about Trimsheets. I like hard surface art a lot, and with hard surface, it's really easy to use Trimsheets and to use them in your workflow to just speed up your process and make everything look pretty cohesive and nice. So an example being in this portfolio piece right here, this entire ship here in the middle was made out of a trim sheet, which is down here. So it was this trim sheet right here. So kind of just a introduction to trim sheets and why we use them is uh, it really makes it easier to speed up the process of creating assets. Um, and it helps make everything look a bit cohesive. It makes the art style make a lot more sense. So this is like a good example of how Doom uses trim sheets. This is decals in particular, decals and greebles, but those are often part of trim sheets. So you could really see like how they use decals and uh, trim sheets in order to really bring everything together and their whole process here. I think this is a really cool gift to really show that. And they have like a couple more here. Um, so basically, what we're gonna go through today is like why we use them. After that, I'm gonna go into the planning. Uh, then I will talk about the process and substance designer and how to really go about the creation of the trims as well. After that, I'm going to go into the modeling process and just give you a couple of tips and tricks for it. Um, I'm also going to be using Blender, so there are a couple of add-ons that you need in Blender in order to really get trim sheets working because their default UV editing is not great. Um, and then finally, I'll just go into Unreal Engine, set up a material, a basic material, and how you can use material to kind of defeat some of the issues that trim sheets tend to have. I kind of talked about this a little bit already, but there are some pros and cons to trim sheets. Um, One of the biggest pros of trim sheets is that it's really good for iteration. Um, if you have a prop and you want to change the way it looks, you can just change the certain aspects of the trim, or you could use an entirely different trim. And if they are made in the same way, then they can look completely different. Another pro is it's a lot quicker to use a trim sheet when you're making props and modular pieces. And that is because you don't really have to you don't have to bake at all. So you don't have to make a high quality. Most of the time, when you're making a prop or a modular piece with trims, you are using the mid poly workflow, which I will go more into detail once we get to like the modeling portion of it. Another advantage is it saves on texture memory and draw calls. So um, since you are using one trim sheet, one texture sheet for uh, multiple props, you don't have to worry about bringing in a normal map for every single prop on the map. So it ends up saving a lot there. And since you're not using as many texture sheets, you save on draw calls as well. And then I also talked a little bit before about how uh, it makes it easier for the art style to be cohesive since you're using the same trim sheet. You don't have to worry about things looking out of place and things not matching and looking awkward. So, and then we go into the cons of trim sheets, and the thing about trim sheets is that There are cons to it, but there are ways around them. One of them is that they can be expensive inverts when you are using them on props, and that's because you're using the mid poly workflow. The cool thing is, inverts aren't as much as a problem as they used to be, with technology constantly improving, and now with Unreal Engine 5, you don't really need to worry as much about how expensive an actual mesh is. Another thing is that it can get repetitive, especially if your trim sheet is too detailed. You'll often see the same things, and because of that, you can start to see that, okay, this was over here, everything starts to look the same. A cool way to fix that is just by using materials. You can use like different types of tint masking, kind of hide the fact that it is the same trim. Or what I often see is that games will have some baked assets in their games in order to spice things up a little. As most things, too much of one thing is often not great. So with all of that in mind, I kind of just want to show some more examples of trim sheets. Obviously, Halo uses trim sheets quite extensively, and you could really see in here the versatility that they put into their trim sheets. Um, but you can also see that these top ones here, they are pretty detailed, but they're also not very specific. And that helps because with trim sheets, if you see the same pattern over and over again, it's easy for it to get repetitive. Um, and that's just definitely something that you want to avoid. So there's just some more examples of your trim sheets. Those aren't. And then another example is it doesn't always have to be hard surface. You could use trim sheets for architecture as well. We do that in Rogue Company a lot. We use trim sheets for pretty much everything, but especially with architecture, it's good for bricks and the actual trims of the architecture, like you see here. And then this is an example of his trim. So it's also nice to have a smaller Greeble detail in your trim. That way you can use them as floaters to just put on top of the mesh. And that's a good way to break up the repetition that you often see in trim sheets to put Greebles. I think this one ended up being pretty cool. So this one I like because it shows like a lot of the power of like the decals. You kind of see his trim here. So this isn't the best example of what the actual trim looks like, but um, it's a good example of how powerful trim sheets can be. All right. So now that I kind of gave like a little summary about trim sheets and why we use them, I'm just gonna go ahead and dive right into um, actually the planning of how I make the trims. So, of course, as with pretty much everything, you want to collect reference, as much reference as possible. What I like to do is I like to collect reference of actual trims, which is what most of this was. I was just collecting references of trims that I liked, just to get some ideas, uh, and then I also collect reference of what I'm making in order to see like what I would need. A good example is for this. I ended up grabbing a couple of the shapes that I liked in order to get ideas for greebles, because greebles are what help a ton to really make it stand out. And then I also tried to find shapes along longer edges that I could incorporate into my trim sheet. So stuff like this line here, I really liked how they had these small rectangles in there. So I added some of those into my trim sheet. Um, I also liked this shape here, so I decided that that would be a greeble that I would definitely want. Um, I also liked how in here there were wires and just other things going on. And in one iteration of my trim sheet, I tried to put these in, but it was too busy. And so I found that the trim that I put that part in was kind of not very useful because um, it was just a part that was very obvious, and that's not something that you want on trims because, like I said, it just makes it too repetitive, too obvious that you're using the same exact trim on every part of it. And then I also use the reference to just think of the design of what I'm actually making, to kind of help determine what my trim sheet will look like in terms of um, shape. So another thing that's important when you're making the trim sheet is to kind of keep texel density in mind. And I'm not going to go into super detail on um, texel density because that's something that you can spend a lot of time explaining. But the gist of it is how much texel you will have in a certain portion of your UV. And it's essentially just how much information. So most games have a texel density of 512 pixels per meter. So I tried to keep this keep 512 pixels per meter in mind while creating this. And the thing about trim sheets is with pixel density, it's never going to be perfect because you really have to size everything to fit. So there will be some stretching, and your pixel density won't be perfect, but it is still something that you need to keep in mind so that everything looks coherent and there isn't one piece of the mesh that is incredibly detailed and one that isn't. So pixel density is still important and something that you want to keep in mind for sure when you are using a trim sheet. Okay, so when I'm making my trim sheet, another thing is that uh, when you're making your actual trim parts, you want to have usually about half of the trim you will want with detail. But you always want at least two parts that don't have detail on it. And that is so that when you are using um, your trim to texture just normal pieces where you don't want the trim, you have somewhere to put it. Um, so let me actually show this. An example being like on this edge right here, I didn't want too much detail there because it would make it too busy. So I used this thin strip here in order to texture that part. And it's important to have one bigger one and one smaller one, and that is because textile density, right? If you need to stretch this all the way and scale it all the way up to fit inside here, then the uh, detail and the small detail is going to be much finer than it would be everywhere on your mesh, and it would stand out. And the same goes for larger pieces, like the side piece here. I just UV'd it, made cuts, and then ended up putting it here in the center. If I had to scale it all the way down just to fit in this tiny strip, then um, it would be very low resolution and it would stand out from the rest of the asset. So those are all just some things that it's really a really good idea to keep in mind when you're making your trim sheet. Is just make sure that your textile density is something that you're thinking about. So I decided that I wanted two pieces up here that were smaller. That way I could have smaller strips with detail. So, and I also usually have a couple of medium-sized ones. That way it fills everything that I need to fill. So it's smart to be able to have a lot of variety in here. That way you're not just restricting yourself to one size. Because if you do that, then problems will arise. All right, so I'm just gonna dive in a bit here and kind of show you the process that I used when making the actual trims. Um, I'll start with this guy right there, which is this one. So what I like to do first is pick out the sizes, lay them out, and I use just regular shape node for it. So I'll grab a shape node, I'll use a square, and then I'll transform it to where I want it to go. To get the sharp bevel, there are two nodes that you could use. You could use the bevel node here that I used, or you could use the blur blur HQ grayscale node to create like the same type of bevel that you get there. I like to use the bevel node because you get more control over the actual bevel using like the smooth. It determines how smooth the actual bevel is. But I've also seen the Blur HQ node used, and that's because I'm pretty sure that it's a little bit cheaper. But I also think that the quality of the bevel is a little bit nicer. So, but it comes down to personal preference, really. As with most things in 3D, is that there are many ways to do the same exact thing. So, is no way what I'm telling you guys the best way to do it. It's just the way that I have found that works for me and I like doing the most. So after I got the main shape, the main backup is there we go. So after I got the main shape, that's just me adding like the smaller trims up there. But after I got the main rectangle in there, I started making the smaller shapes. And you'll see a lot when making trims, especially hard surface trims, is you'll be using the shape nodes and the transform nodes a lot. So I like to use the blur to round out the actual shape. Um, so I will blur it and then use the levels node to um, bring everything in. And then again, I use the transform node just to slide it over, and then I mirrored it over. Um, Now, these are some shapes that I actually decided to take out of my trim because the shape itself was getting too repetitive. But I just wanted to show this because I find myself using this a lot in Substance Designer when I want to make a more rounded shape. It's just blurring it and then using the levels node. Um, Something else that I found really helpful when using Substance Designer is Daniel Theiger's tutorials. He pretty much taught me like 50% of what I know um, in Substance Designer. And one that actually helped out a lot with um, hard surface in particular was this tutorial. That he made. It's really cool, and everything in here was made in Substance Designer. Something that I found particularly helpful with this tutorial was that he actually has a bunch of different nodes in the tutorial that he custom made for hard surface that really helps speed up the process of making different parts. So if you need resources on kind of how to get started, then Daniel Theiger is a good place to go to. He also has a bunch of fundamental tutorials, and those are good. Actually, let me just pull out my resource list because I had them saved. Um, yes. So his fundamental tutorials are really good tutorials to get started out with on Substance Designer if you aren't familiar with it. So, okay. So now when I was making this shape, I wanted to add these vertical lines in there. And it was actually really easy to do because all I did was grab a tile sampler. So I made the base shape, um, I cropped it so that it was centered, and then I put it into the tile sampler, put it into the pattern input one, and then used the levels node to be able to control the height a little bit. I didn't end up using it, but if I wanted to, I could just bring it down to control the height a little bit. And then I overlaid it on top of that. Behind here, I just used another shape node with a bevel and then subtracted it. So, and then when you use the overlay, it just overlays it on top of it, and you get that cool shape in there. I like this extra bevel right there, and that's the part that the subtract makes. So I always throw a levels node at the end of most of them just to be able to control the height because you don't always want to have your height go all the way black because black is as far down as it can go. So when you're using parallax occlusion, when it's going all the way black, it tends to go too deep and it looks a little weird. So that's something that I try to avoid when using Substance Designer is I don't always want it to be black unless I need that extra information in the height map. I think this is more, yeah, this is a more complicated one right here. So this one is the one with the pipes, and pipes tend to be kind of weird to make in Substance Designer because uh, you have to start out with just a regular rectangle, and then from there you do have to blur it in order to get like the rounded edges, and sometimes it doesn't always translate great to the height map like it does there. And there are other ways to fix that. One of them is to actually so instead of having a perfect shaped L right there, you could grab a you just grab another shape node and you could angle it. Um, and angling it makes it so that you don't get that kind of weird thick part right there in the center when it's starting to curve. So you always want to try your best to line it up, because when you don't do that, um, it ends up showing in the blur, and it doesn't look great. Probably turned my notifications off. Cool. So once I blurred it, you could see that it's this middle one here. Um, and you can see that it curves a little bit better than it does on there. So um, it is a little bit more time consuming to make it that way, but the results tend to look um, better. So definitely worth something or worth doing. So once I made the pipes, another thing that I like to do first is I like to make the shapes first, and then scale them down. Instead of when I first started out with Substance Designer, I would scale them while making the shapes. So, like, if I had this pipe piece right here, I would make it and then scale it and then copy that with the scale already down. Um, and that's not very helpful because it kind of takes longer if you need to iterate it on it more, because then you have to go back and you have to change each individual scale. So uh, I like to just combine everything into one and then do the transformations that I need to do on it. Another example being like this shape here. Again, I just use your basic square shape, use the transformations on it. I used the subtract in order to get the curved end, and then I mirrored it there. I use mirror a lot, especially on hard surface, just because it helps with the symmetry, and then I don't have to make copies and try to manually rotate it and put it where it needs to go. So once I have that part subtracted, I ended up putting the pipes in there with a max lighten. And the reason why I decided to make the height all black here with the subtract is because I knew that I wanted to layer things on top of the pipes. So I needed that height information in order to layer it. So I did a max light in here and put it on 0.3. And then for this extra piece there, that indentation, I did pretty much the same thing where I have my base shape and I used a trapezoid transform in order to give it the angled edges. And then I transformed it and used a mirror grayscale and did another max lighten up here. I think I didn't need to do a max lighten. I probably could have just done a add linear dodge. But I controlled again the height in a levels node, but I could also have just controlled it in the add linear dodge. I like to use a levels node to control the height just because it gives me control over if I wanted to also make it like lighter. But if I were to do that, I would have to put a mask as well in order to not bring up the height in this area. So after I used the add linear dodge here, I think this is where I just added the other trim up here. Yeah. It doesn't actually matter too much when you add it, so just did this here because that's when I wanted to. But I used another shape, and instead of using a tile sampler on here, I just used a transform node and scaled it horizontally in order to make thinner strips. And then I used the levels node to bring down the height again, and then just did another max lighten. So I used a subtract for just a basic shape, transformed it, blurred it in order to get the nice bevel in there, and then subtracted it. And did a linear dodge, which is pretty much the opposite of what I did here, except I scaled this, scaled it down a little bit more so that I could fit it in there, and then just did an add linear dodge in order to add the shape in there. And then Same exact thing. Like I said before, it's a lot of just using shape nodes and transform node in order to get the shapes that you want. And so for this shape, I used just another rectangle, transformed it down, and then used a mirror grayscale to get the two here on the side. So I ended up using just copying and paste it, and then mirroring this one on the y-axis to get the center one. Um, and then for the so to get these shapes here in the center, I did the same thing that I did for these ones, except for the reverse, where instead of using a max line, I just did a mint darken. And then I mess with the opacity to bring down the main part. So you don't have to use Substance Designer in order to make your shapes. I know that there are people out there that like to use Photoshop in order to make the shapes, and it is oftentimes faster to make your shapes in Photoshop because you don't have to mess with nodes at all. But the downside to using Photoshop is that you can't iterate on it as quickly as you can in Substance Designer. Because in Substance Designer, if you decide that you want this rectangle to be a little bit thinner, all you have to do is you have to go to the node that you made the shape in, and then just scale it with the transform node, and then um, bam, it's done. If you're doing it in Photoshop, you have to open up Photoshop, you have to either make a new shape or go into the shape and erase whatever it is, and then you have to re-import it, and that's more time consuming. You could also have like open parameters in Substance Designer where you can just have a scaling slider that controls, let's say, all of the rectangles in a shape. Whereas in Photoshop, that's not a functionality you would be able to take advantage of because it's not part of Substance Designer. So there are advantages to both. Just whichever one works best for what you're trying to do. Um, Another reason that uh, I like to use Substance Designer is that it's really just a program that I'm more comfortable with. Trimsheets can be made in pretty much anything. You could model them in Blender. You can sculpt them in ZBrush. It really comes down to personal preference. Um, there was a trim sheet in my list that was actually made in Blender. One. I think this is actually made in 3ds Max, right? And I find myself liking Designer more because even though it takes a little bit longer in the long run than modeling, usually when you make changes, it'll be faster because of that. Because again, for the same reason with kind of like the Photoshop example, if you decide that you want to change a basic shape in a trim sheet that you modeled, you'll end up having to remodel that trim itself most of the time. Whereas Substance Designer, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can just change whatever shape you want without having to worry about rebaking, without having to worry about um, taking it into a different program and retexturing it or anything like that. Uh, Oftentimes, people will bake in or they'll model in whatever 3D software they're modeling in, and then take it into Substance Painter to texture it or Substance Designer to texture it to kind of save on the fact that you had to model it in 3D software. When you take it into Substance Designer, um, it still gives you a bit of that procedural aspect and speeds up the texturing process a bit. Um, so at the bottom part here, I always add Greebles because Greebles help a ton with really making your assets stand out. Um, so all of these again are just basic shapes transformed to look how I want them to look. So this piece right here is just here, and what I did was use subtract with the basic shapes in order to get this one, and then I blurred it. I used the levels to get the rounding on it, like I showed before, and then I made a copy of it and just messed with the scale just to get it smaller, and then I used the subtract node. Again, I made the shape first before making it the size that it needed to be, and then I put it there where it needs to go. And then this was the shape that I showed earlier in my references that I thought would be cool to have. Um, and this shape itself was kind of hard to make because it's rounded and it has that gradient in it where white being higher, black being lower. And that was kind of hard to dial into just because when you're messing with height maps, things don't always look like how you want them to when you're initially making it. So on here, I combine two circles and use the transform node to kind of scale it to give it a more oval shape. And then I combine them here and used a transform node again to scale it to give it the more egg shape. And then I wasn't happy with how wide it was, but obviously by widening it, it loses the oval shape. So I used a mirror grayscale in order to make it a bit wider. And then I ended up using a subtract with just another transformed square to get the diagonal edges. And then I used a trapezoid transform to stretch it on the bottom a bit more. And then to kind of get it a bit rounder, I blurred it and used the levels node. So we had like this sharp edge here, and then it just rounds it out and makes it look a lot nicer. And then to get the gradient, I used a blend with the gradient axial. I love using the gradient axial because it gives you a lot more control over your gradient. Instead of having to mess with the regular gradient and move your object around to kind of get the gradient you need. It's easier to use the gradient axial because you could actually just control where you want your gradient. So it's a lot easier to get the shape that you want and the gradient where you need it to go. So I use the auto levels here to level out the height, and then I used another blur and subtracted it from the white shape that I scaled up in order to get the edge there. And then for this shape, the circle in the center, I just grabbed a disc, I beveled it, transformed it so that it fit a bit better inside of there. And then that's how I made that shape. Scaled it down and then put it where I thought it would need to go. Okay, there it goes. So another shape that I thought was pretty fun to make was this one here. I wanted a cool kind of like panel thing to put, not panel, like the word escapes me. So what I did was grabbed your square shape and then I used a trapezoid transform again. I find myself using the trapezoid transform a lot, just because you get a lot of the angled edges, and it's the only way to really do it in Substance Designer. So this is a very useful node. So I used the trapezoid transform and transformed it up. I added it to just your another square shape. And then I made a copy of it down here, transformed it up, and then blended the two together with another subtract in order to get the inner edge here. And then I transformed this one and blended it again, scaled it down, blended it with another subtract to get this depth here. And then I blurred them all together to get the beveled edge. And for the internal shape, it's just a bunch of different add linear dodges. Again, using the blur and level trick to get the rounded edges. And then for here, I used the gradient axial again in order to blend it with a multiply and mirrored it on the edges, and that gave the angled edge there that you see. So right in there, I transformed it into that shape, and then I added them together, blurred it to get the beveled edge, and then max lightened it. And the reason why I've been using blur instead of the bevel node is when you use the bevel node on more defined shapes, it often loses that definition. So I like to use a blur HQ on smaller shapes that I don't want to get destroyed. And then for these two buttons here, I just used two circles with different scales and subtracted them, mirrored it, and then add linear dodge them. Same idea here. I had the gradient linear. Gradient linear 2 is really good for making pipes or pretty much anything with the cylinder shape on it. So I just had the two, transformed them, added them, mirrored them, and then did another add linear dodge there. For the shape, I just did 2 squares, scaled down, and then added them together and did another max lighten. Yeah, it gets a bit repetitive showing showing these parts because it's all pretty much the same idea where you just have your basic shape and you transform it, use add linear dodge, subtracts in order to get the shapes that you need, blurring it to get the bevel, and then adding it. So then once I have the main shape again, I use the transform node to scale it down and then put it down here with my Greebles. Now, when I'm using my trim sheets, I also like to think of shapes that I could use that when I'm actually modeling and texturing, if I could mirror those shapes, would they look cool? So, example being this one right here. I actually use this shape a ton, and then in the actual piece, I would just mirror them, and I kind of get shapes that aren't necessarily in the trim, but I can still create because I mirrored. So this is just that panel there mirrored, and I did the same thing up here. There's some stretching up here because it's not seen, and that's okay. But it is just this panel right here. Me. So that panel, flipped upside down and then mirrored. So I'll also show how I did that once we get to the modeling section because you do need to add geometry in order to do it. But, so once we get the shapes that we want, and I'm not gonna go like into how I made all of them, but like if you have questions about how they're made, like feel free to ask and I will answer at the end of the video during the Q&A section. But so after we have all of our shapes, I start to work on the color a little bit. And when you're working with trim sheets, you can really kind of overdo it with color. And again, that's not something that you generally want to do because then it'll stand out too much. So I tried to add enough color to where it's not boring, but also to where it is not repetitive. And it's something that's hard to balance. I'm I had a iteration of this where these strips here were also this blue color, but when I was applying it to the texture, it was too repetitive, so I ended up having to take it out. But in order to color it, what I did was I would just find the pieces that I wanted colored, and I would make a mask for them. So for like this piece here, I grabbed the basic shape that I had, and then I copied the transform node to where I put it, and I pasted it, and used the levels node to make the bevel go away. So I just tightened it there, and then I added that to my mask, my color mask up here. And I did that with every shape that I wanted colored, and I added them all together. And then I just threw a gradient map on it. And that's how I got the blue shape up here. Now, I like to start out with like just a basic uniform color as a base, and then from there I use all my other nodes that I created to give the color. So I added some edge wear in here, and edge wear is actually really fun to make in Substance Designer because they have a bunch of different nodes that you can use. And I use the edge damage node and the metal edge wear node. And they use a normal map and a curvature, normal and curvature node in order to produce that. So the normal controls also, the normal and the curvature will control how much edge damage there is. So you can mess with these two parameters to kind of lower how much edge wear there is. There is parameters in here that you can use to change the wear level, but if you want it to be more specific, then you could use the normal and curvature node in order to mess with it a little bit more. So I did the edge damage node because I wanted like a base edge damage. And then I added it with the metal edge wear because I wanted parts where the edge wear is more defined. And I added them together. And so like the grayer areas are the areas that don't have the extreme visible edge wear, and then the white is where it is very metallic and defined. And then I used a scratch generator to just add the smaller scratches that you see in there. So once I have that, I use the same map in order to give the color for it. Where is it? Here we go. And I ended up just doing an add with a levels on it. I also like to use just a ambient occlusion blended with a histogram range. So what the histogram range does is it generally will kind of level out all of the colors to be just one, or all the levels. I forgot. Give me a sec. Okay, so the histogram range just adjusts the range of the height map, or the ambient occlusion in this case. so that everything's a bit more even. And then I multiply it with the ambient occlusion in order to get the darker parts of the height map. And I throw it into a gradient map, and I just do a copy with a low opacity level to kind of give cool color variation into it. I often see this because if it's flat, it tends to just not look as good, um, and it gives it more depth. So this is just adding the blue mask that I added, and then I added a grunge map with shape splatter in order to just add more color variation. So again, it's not flat. And when you do that, like when you look at this map, it kind of looks like it's something that is repetitive and you would see, but you would see the repetition. But once you add it, it really just makes a cool weathered effect to it. And you don't see the repetition at all. And then this is adding the color of the edge wear. And then again, I ended up using a mask for those pipes that I made. So I had to make a mask, which was essentially just I grabbed the pipes. I used a levels node, and then in order to get the top part of the mask, I had grabbed the shape, transformed it, and subtracted it. And then I subtracted the vertical parts there, and then subtracted this other piece there, and subtracted that and added that to the gradient map. And then I just did a copy with the same exact mask in order to add the color there. So this is here. I just did another multiply of the AO and the histogram range. And then for these Greebles down here, I made a metallic mask with all of the metal I guess screws. I used that mask, copied it, and added them in there. So another example is I did end up using Photoshop to make basic shapes just to show like that it can be done. And honestly, you shouldn't be afraid to use Photoshop in order to make some of your shapes. I know that a lot of people pride themselves in using Substance Designer only, but if you're in a time crunch, there's nothing wrong with using Substance Designer, especially. I mean, there's nothing wrong with using Photoshop, especially if you're making more complicated shapes that would just be easier to make in Photoshop. So for the roughness, I like to start out with the height map, and mess with the levels from there. Let me find like the beginning. Yeah, I was actually talking to Tim earlier about this, where you think you know your substance designer, but then it ends up being a while before, or it ends up being a long time since you've opened it, and then you go back to it and you're like, I don't know where everything is. And that's kind of a moment that's happening right now. So I think on this one I ended up using the scratch generated map and then adjusting it with the levels node. Yeah. Okay, so I had an invert grayscale, and then I used the levels node to bring it down, and then I used another invert grayscale with the metal map, and then I copied it over it, and then for here I just use a subtract node because I wanted the pipes to be a little bit shinier than the rest of it. And then I added a subtract just for the edge variation. I mean, not the edge variation, just for more variation with the roughness. And I used B&W spots and a grunge map, and I multiplied them together and then just subtracted it in order to get that variation. And I like to combine different maps together. That way you get different variation than what comes stock with Substance Designer. Because when you're first starting out, it's a lot easier to just use your basic ones, but adding the variation really helps yours stand out from helps like roughness maps and even color variation stand out from other people who don't do this. And it doesn't seem like something that is really noticeable, but once you've been working in Substance Designer for years and you see other people's work, you start to notice the same shapes and you start to realize what they used. And it's not necessarily bad, but it's a lot nicer when you look at something and you don't know how they came up with a certain shape or a variation in some way. It just makes everything look a bit more professional. So for this one, I ended up grabbing the ambient occlusion and the histogram range combination, and I subtracted that in. And I did that just to get different levels in the roughness, which isn't like PBR, but it looks better. So that's something kind of cool about being an artist, right? Is that PBR is nice, but if it looks good, then why not? And then so that's how I got my roughness map. It's really important to make sure that with your edgeware, since it is edgeware, it's going to be it's gonna need to have different roughness. You want it to be shinier, obviously. So that's just something that when I was first starting out in Substance Designer that I would forget to do, and yeah, just something to point out. With the metallic map, I did pretty much the same thing. I grabbed the scratches and the mask of all of my bolts, and I combined them together. And then I just use the levels node to really make it so that the metallic portions of it would stand out. I wanted them to be really shiny so that when you get in engine, it will be obvious, and look good. And here I just added that one circular part right in there. And I do have an emissive map that I put in here, and the emissive is just for these guys. Let me turn it on. So I put the two emissive pieces in here, and I made the emissive the same way that you would make mask. You just grab the pieces that you want as emissive, you add them, and then put them as a gradient map. And then in Substance Designer, you just do an output for the emissive. And yeah. And then something else that you usually want to do, especially with your Greebles, is you want to add a mask. Oh, it was right there. All right, so you want to make your mask. And the mask is helpful for Greebles for when you overlay it on top as floaters. If you don't have a mask, you will often see a seam when you use a floater, and it doesn't look good. So a mask comes in handy. An opacity mask comes in handy, especially for your Greebles. And the mask is made the same way as I made the color mask up there. Is I just grabbed the major shape of everything that I made. So like for this piece right here, I would grab this, I would copy the transformation of the piece, and then I would add it to the mask part. I think I started all. Yeah. And then I just used a subtract. I did this one a little weird. You could do it so that you just have the white one, but I think it was easier to just have the shape at the bottom and then subtract all the main pieces. And then I used an invert. That way I could add it. Yeah. Cool. So that's pretty much how I went about making that part, or the main trim. So once you are done with your trim, get into the fun part of modeling. And when you're modeling trims, when you're modeling for a prop that uses trims, it's different than when you're modeling for a regular prop that's being baked. And that's because you're not baking at all. So you don't have to really worry about making a high and low poly. So we use a workflow called mid poly, where you use weighted normals, or you could use like a smooth shading. So I tend to use a combination of weighted normals and smooth shading. And that's because with weighted normals, you generally need beveled edges. And if you have every edge beveled, then things get pretty expensive pretty quick. So I usually only bevel when I need to. For example, this piece up here, um, I couldn't lay the trim out easily enough in order to get the beveled edges that I wanted all around these edges. So I ended up just manually adding in the bevels. If I could, um, I would do like what I did here, where I would use the bevels from the trim to generate the bevels inside of the mesh. So in order to do that, it's all about how you UV. And when you're using Blender, the stock UV is not great. It's not good at all. Because it doesn't come with like an easy way to straighten your UVs, and that's something that's really important to do when you are using trims. So if you're using Blender, you definitely want to get the UV toolkit add-on. It's not free, but it's a UV toolkit 2.0 for Blender by Alex Dev. And it makes everything much easier when you're using Blender and you're UVing in it. So, just for an example of like when you're texturing and modeling with UVs, is I'm not gonna go like in depth of the actual modeling, so this is gonna be more about like the UV part of it. Um, so I like to grab the edges that I want as a trim, and then I will just unwrap them, and then grab it, straighten it out. I like to rotate it, um, and then put it where it wants to go. And like I said, when you're working with trims, pixel density is something that is important and to be aware of, but it's hard to make it perfect. And I think this is a good example because I have another add-on. It's called Texel Density Checker, and it'll check your texel density. And if I calculate it right now, you're seeing that it's at 1016 pixels per meter, which is pretty high. But there isn't an easy way to avoid situations like that with Trimsheets. The only way to really do that is to try your best to, when you're creating it, have certain sizes in mind, but that's not always possible when you're using a trim sheet on multiple different props with different sizes. So, and then when you are UVing and modeling, I talked before about how you could use mirroring to get like different shapes that aren't necessarily on your trim. Yeah, so I was talking before how you could mirror in order to get different shapes that aren't necessarily on your trim. That's kind of what I did on this piece right here. Is I added a edge right down the middle. That way I could mirror each side here and get these cool strips from the trim down here in the center, or I mean on the sides offset. And then what I did so that the roughness and everything else weren't mirrored and as obvious was I just offsetted them a little bit so that the roughness variation didn't match. And actually, let me open up Unreal so I could show. While we wait for that to open, I will also show the same thing up here. So what I did was on this part, I just made a seam again, or an edge here in the center. And I mirrored it so that even though we only have this shape right here, since it's mirrored, you get this shape. So you see up here where it's mirrored in order to get the shape that I wanted. And then I ended up kind of having to find the center of these bolts in order to make it so that it doesn't look obvious that it's mirrored. Yeah, they're stacked on top of each other. That's why you didn't see the other UV. So another thing, when you're texturing using Trimsheets, is there are a couple of ways to add greebles. One would be floaters, and the other is to actually add the geo into the mesh. I personally like to I personally like to use floaters just because it gives you a bit more flexibility. You can just get a plane like I have here, and then use the edge tool to you could use the edge tool to find the Greeble that you want and kind of mask out the shape. And then I like to duplicate it and separate it. And once you have it separated, you could actually use a snap tool, and you can snap by face, align rotation to target, change it to center, and then allow the rotate on it. And then when you use that, when you move it, it'll just snap to the face that you want it to be on. And then from there, you can just scale it to whatever size that you want it to be at. And then you also want to like pull it away from the mesh slightly, because if it sits directly on top like it is here, Unreal Engine won't be able to read it properly because the normals will be flashing, and you'll just get a weird result. So that's how I laid out all of these greebles, was with that snap to face tool, which is very helpful with doing that. there is also not a huge like cost difference between manually adding the shapes um, into the geo and doing floaters. So I personally would just always use floaters. Another thing is with panel lining, like here, you could also put it inside of your geo by just using like a loop tool or a loop cut tool. But I'll tend to just make a copy of the face and do the same thing. Well, I'll duplicate it and separate it. And then I'll make the panel cut using the knife tool. Um, or I'll inset it to kind of get the shape that I want, depending on the mode or depending on how I want it to look. If you hit C when using the knife tool, it will make it so that it snaps to whichever angle is closest. So accidentally hit escape. Yeah, the downside to using the knife tool is that you're kind of just eyeballing it, so it's not going to be perfect. But once I have the main panel line made, I'll just bevel it, and then I'll separate it again. I use a hotkey, which is just Control B to bevel, and then a hotkey of P and P again in order to separate the selection. And then I'll just delete the face that I pulled out, and then you have your panel line. And then with the panel line, you would just go to the straighten button here. You'd rotate it again, and you just scale it down on one of the edges, or on the bevel. Yeah. Again, that's not a... Usually you'll want it to be a bit cleaner than that, but as a quick example, that's how you would go about doing that. Cool. So you can see how there in the center, back to the roughness variation, why I offset it. The roughness isn't exactly mirrored. And then right in there, like there's no seam in the center or anything like that, because when you are UVing it, as long as they are part of the same shape, there's usually not enough variation or difference to really see a difference. Not enough to see like a seam. That's just another thing that I like to do is when you are using your greebles, if you need specific shapes like this, which were just those indented parts that I made. I did a similar thing to what I did with the panel lines, in that I would grab this piece and I would, my geos, there's tries, so it's not as easy to make cuts. But I would do pretty much the same thing. In this instance, I would just change it to vertex to make sure that vertex snapping to make sure that the line is straight. And then I would bevel again. And I would separate it. Duplicate and separate. And then I would go in and make the shape that I want. Again, this is quick and dirty. And then just unwrap it, do another straighten. And scale it down on there. Right now it has a different material on it. But I didn't make it the right side. I guess that's a downside to quick and dirty. But if we go to the non-quick and dirty version, I same way where I separated it. I duplicated the part, separated it from the selection, and then just unwrapped it, scaled it down, and that's how I got those pieces there. So all of these pieces, then I think the only piece that I actually have bevels on is this piece up here. Everything else I just use the trim to create like the beveled edges. And you really can't see a huge difference between the actual bevels and the trim bevels. And it ends up saving a lot on geo, on tries when you do it this way. The downside and why I did it there is because sometimes it's hard to get the bevels where you want it where you want them to be, because of the different shapes. If we look at this back piece here, I don't have any of the bevel except for at the bottom on this side of the face. It's there at the bottom. I think that's mirrored. And so when we look at the back, you see it there, but you don't really see it here on the side. Now this is somewhere that I could have beveled if I wanted to, but it was the back, and I wasn't really too worried about anyone seeing back there. Because I made this piece quickly, and it was meant to kind of just be viewed from this angle right here. So, just another example of how you would lay these out. Or something that I forgot to mention, when you are using a trim sheet to texture, you generally don't want to automatically start with the smaller details, I guess. What I like to do is I will just texture it first, without worrying about all of the fine detail, like adding the greebles and what greebles I want where, or what trim necessarily I want. I'll usually start with kind of these two trims here, and lay it out that way first. And then after that, once I have it textured in the basic way, I will start adding more detail to it. And the reason why I do that is because if you automatically start with the more detailed trims and the greebles, then it'll get very busy quickly. And so just like when you're modeling or creating with anything else, you generally want to worry about your primary, secondary, and tertiary detail in that order. So what I did here was, once I was finished doing the basic layout, I determined where I wanted like my bigger trims and how I wanted them set up. So I would add like these details here. And these guys here are just floaters. So I would add those ones. I would import it into Unreal, see how I like it, and then continue onward. And then I do my greebles last, and if I decide that I want to add more detail, then instead of having to delete floaters or go through the process of making floaters, I can just add it and not waste any time doing it that way. So once it's textured, we can really just go into Unreal. I know it's already been like almost 2 hours, so kind of don't want to take up much more time. So I'm kind of going to go over a bit on how you would set up your materials. But in order to do that, I need to go back to Substance Designer to show how I set up the outputs. So we always have our base color, and I have my emissive map. It's small, only 2. And then I got my roughness, height, metallic, normal, AO. There's a ton of them. So what a lot of people do now is they'll pack their maps into one texture. It's called packing texture. Um, Oftentimes people will put the metallic in the red channel, the roughness in the green channel, and the AO in the blue channel. Um, it kind of doesn't matter where you put things except for the green channel, because the green channel has the most information. So you generally want to put your roughness in the green channel, because that one has the most information, and your roughness contributes to a lot compared to your like metallic and AO. And in Substance Designer, they have an RGBA merge node. So um, you just put it in there, and then for the MRAO, I just did an output named MRAO. So then I don't have to worry about having those 3 different textures. They're all just packed into one. So once we're in Unreal Engine, it's pretty easy to set up like a basic trim texture. Now, this is as basic as they come, but you can do a ton with an Unreal shader. I'm not going to go into those ones, but what I did was I used parallax occlusion. When you're setting up parallax occlusion, your height map will go into your height map texture here. I kept the height ratio at 0.01 and made it a parameter. That way I can adjust it in a material instance. And then for the height map channel, you always put it as the red in the 4 vector. So when you have your parallax occlusion mapping, that's what gives the trim sheet like a little bit of depth into it. Otherwise, if you're just doing normals, it tends to look a little bit flatter. Well, a bit flatter. And I actually was using normals before, but I wasn't happy with the way it was looking, so I added parallax occlusion just to give it that extra depth. And your parallax occlusion will just go into the UVs of all of your other maps. Yes, I didn't put in there. It's not as important for your other ones. Mostly you would want it in like your normals. So I have my albedo, and I multiplied it by a color tint. That way you could have different color variation. I didn't make that main piece blue, but right here, these guys blue, but I did want it to have blue in it, so I just made a material instance that has a blue tint on it, and that's how I ended up getting these blue pieces on it that weren't in the trim. And then for the roughness, I have the green channel. I multiply it again by just another parameter, so I could have basic control over the roughness. There are other ways to do this, but again, I just wanted to make an extremely basic material. And then for the emissive intensity, I did the same thing, just the emissive map multiplied by a parameter, put in the emissive color. For the mask, I put it in the opacity mask. And you want to make sure that your blend mode is in mask. Otherwise, it doesn't mask out the pieces like it does here. And then your normal, you just slap into your normal. And then the AO from blue channel goes into the ambient occlusion. And then the metallic goes into the red channel. I'm using Unreal 5, and I don't think Lumen uses ambient occlusion in the material, but I'm not sure about that. So if you're using Unreal 4, this definitely is the way you want to go, but in Unreal 5, I'm not sure if you need an ambient occlusion map for Lumen. So that is just your basic material setup. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to show you guys. I do have like if you guys want to, if you get any more questions, especially on YouTube, feel free to like message me on ArtStation. I check it all the time and I'll get back to you as quick as possible. For like the Beyond Extent people, I'm in Discord. I'm on Discord, obviously. So you could just go ahead and message me here on Discord if you decide that's something you want to do, if you get questions later.
Thank you so much, Ryan Lopez, for taking the time to share this amazing workshop with us at Beyond Extent. Make sure to check out Ryan's work in the description down below. We also want to throw out a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. These workshops are funded and made possible because of your support. If you want to participate in the workshops live, are looking to grow your environment art skills, or just want to be a part of an amazing community, then head on over to beyondextent.com to get started and get access to this community. See you there!